I don't know if there's anything quite like a good mystery. When I was a boy, I remember reading some of those Hardy Boys mysteries. And I'm sure some of you read Hardy Boys books or Nancy Drew mysteries. A few years ago, they made a Nancy Drew movie. And I thought it was a pretty good film. And I loved the part in it where after Nancy Drew had really been immersing herself in the criminal underworld of Los Angeles as a teenager, her dad says to her, "Nancy, I thought I told you, no more sleuthing." We all have that problem of our children trying to solve too many crimes. It was the mystery. She couldn't let it go. It continued to draw her in. And there's nothing better than a real-life mystery. I don't know of one more compelling than that of D.B. Cooper. Maybe some of you have heard of it. In November of 1974, someone calling himself Dan Cooper boarded a flight in Portland, Oregon, bound for Seattle, Washington. Shortly after takeoff, he passed a note to one of the stewardesses saying that he had a bomb and that he had some demands to make. And so through the stewardess, he got a message to the authorities that when the plane would land in Seattle, he wanted $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and then to have the pilot take back off bound for Mexico. Well, the plane circled the Seattle airport for a couple of hours while authorities scrambled, and then when the plane landed, all of the passengers were allowed to get off, and Cooper was provided with $200,000 and 4 parachutes. And indeed, the plane took back off and was headed south towards Mexico. Well, a short time after takeoff, Cooper lowered the staircase, which was on that particular plane at the back, and jumped out. And he was never seen again. To this day, it is an unsolved mystery. No one knows who Cooper really was or what happened to him. A few years after that, in 1980, there was an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram who was camping with his family just outside of Portland. And like an 8-year-old boy, he was digging in the sandy banks of the Columbia River when he uncovered 3 bundles of badly decaying $20 bills. 2 bundles with 100 bills, and 1 bundle with 90 bills. And there wasn't much left of these dollar bills. They had been soaking wet, and they were stuck together, and they were very badly frayed around the edges. But the authorities were able to match the serial numbers on those bills to the serial numbers of some of the bills that had been given to Cooper before the plane had taken off those many years ago. And those fragments of those $20 bills were and remain really the only bits of physical evidence to that particular crime. And yet these bills have raised more questions, actually, than answers. For no one can come up with a good explanation as to why the bills ended up where they did and how they got buried in the sand. And perhaps most mysteriously of all, why one of the bundles was missing 10 bills. And suffice it to say, this tantalizing piece of evidence has gotten the authorities no closer to finding Cooper or learning who he really was. Pictures of those decaying $20 bills remind me to some extent of some of the ancient papyrus fragments on which we find traces of some of the New Testament documents. And it made me wonder, if we had 200 or 300 badly decaying little bits of papyrus from the early Christians, what would we know about them? What would we know about their faith? It's not a real presumption, because in fact there are over 5,000 manuscripts from antiquity of the New Testament. It's by far the most well-attested piece of literature from the ancient world. But pretending just for a minute we had a few scraps of the early Christian writing, what would we know about the early Christians and their faith? I think it's an especially interesting idea if we imagine that we had perhaps just a little scrap of paper that had the first letter of Peter, chapter 1 on it. What could we learn from such an examination? Let's pretend we're undertaking such an examination just for a few minutes, and we'll ask some very basic questions, such as who, where, what, when, and why. First of all, who? Who were these early Christians? Well, Peter said that they were those who had been chosen by God, those who were foreknown by God. When Peter says that the first Christians were those who had been chosen by God, he's wanting to say that it is not they who had taken the initiative and established a relationship with God. It is that God took the initiative and established a relationship with them. And it is because God was the actor and that their relationship was based on God's initiative that there is a knowledge and recognition of God's grace. What we have comes from God, because God is the actor. And what God gives us is what we have simply because God has chosen to give it. Now, what is the method of God's choosing? I don't think it is so much that God has compelled anyone to be a believer or compelled anyone to be a non-believer. It is that God has come to us as human beings in grace, and that in God's wisdom, God has foreknown how we would respond. That God is not surprised that any of us have come to faith. As many of you know, Melissa, my wife, is pregnant. We're expecting our second child in February. And as is typical at this point in a pregnancy, Melissa has had a number of ultrasound images of the baby taken. And many of you will be familiar with this technology, and it's just amazing to me what you can learn about a baby in its mother's womb by this ultrasound. We, for instance, have been able to determine that the baby is a boy. We can tell how big it is. We can count all its fingers and toes. We can see and hear its heart beating. And if you get a really good image, if the baby's turned the right way, you can even begin to tell some facial characteristics of what the child looks like. Now, if we humans, with a machine such as that, can know quite a bit about a child even before it's born, imagine what God, the maker of the universe, and in a very real theological sense, the maker of each one of us, can know about us even before we know it ourselves. God has planned to create each one of us as a unique person, as a very special and dear creation of God. And God has planned to come to us in grace, to create a relationship with each one of us. And in God's great wisdom, God has anticipated and looked forward to our response. So that's who were the early Christians. Where were they? Well, Peter wrote to a group of Christians whom he called sojourners dispersed among some of the various cities of the Roman province of Asia Minor, which was a political entity in the geographical region of modern Turkey. It's very interesting. It's not as common in the New Testament, but is very common in early Christian writings outside of the New Testament to address Christians as sojourners. And what this implies is that the true home of the believer is not the particular city or country in which they happen to believe. The true home of the believer is in heaven. And the geographical location in which they live is a temporary home in which they are sojourning. And the wonderful implication of this, of course, is that at the end of the sojourn, we will return to our true and permanent home with God in heaven. And so we are those who have been dispersed among the nations of the world. And what wonderful good news this is. In a world where people are discriminated against based on where they come from and what they look like or what language they speak, we learn that we are really citizens of heaven. People of God who belong with God and who will be with God forever. I went to Queen's University in Kingston as an undergraduate, and as a result, I sometimes get the alumni magazine in the mail. And usually when I get the magazine, I flip straight to the very back where it has alumni news. People have submitted things that are going on in their lives, and I look to see if any of my old classmates have taken a new job or gotten married, and maybe just to see how rich and successful they've become. It's interesting that no one ever submits news that I'm working at Starbucks and I've moved back in with my parents. And it's also interesting to see how active some of the different branches of the Alumni Association are all over the world. Graduates of the university get together in different parts of the world for pub nights or for family picnics or bus tours or concerts. It seems that Queen's in particular has very active alumni branches in Calgary and in Phoenix, Arizona, and even in Germany. It's interesting to me how these people are of vastly different ages, and they studied in different fields, and they're at different stages of life, and yet wherever they are in the world, they choose to get together. And it's almost like they're saying, my real home is in Kingston, and my real family is the university alumni, and my truest identity is as a graduate of that institution. Friends, wherever we are, our true home is in heaven. Our truest family is the people of God. And our truest identity is as a person of God who has been brought into relationship with God. Next question is, what? What did these people believe? Well, Peter says that they were those who had been born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Now, these people believed with very firm conviction that on the first Easter, God had raised Jesus from the dead. And because of that, they did not have anything in life to worry about or to fear, at least not in the big picture sense. You see, they believed that God, having done that, not only had the ability to overcome evil and death, but had done so, and done so in a demonstrable way. And that if God had done that in the instance of Jesus, that was God's promise for them as well. And Peter was happy to stress that this was a promise that could never be taken away. One of my heroes was the German minister of some 500 years ago named Martin Luther. He had an incredibly impactful life and ministry. His actions, his speaking and his writing led to all kinds of positive changes in the Christian church and in society as well, all relatively unintended by Luther, but simply the result of his willingness to proclaim the truth of the good news about Jesus, even in the face of opposition. And he faced a lot of opposition in his life, and a lot of threats and attacks upon him. And when he was all alone, and he was really anxious, worried, and afraid about what was going to happen to him, he would have this personal ritual. He would say over and over again to himself in German, "Ich bin getauft," which means, "I am baptized," or perhaps, "I have been baptized." Perfect tense, something that had been completed in the past. What he was really saying to himself is that he had been born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and that this had been symbolized and expressed in his baptism, and that no matter what anyone tried to do to him, no one could ever take that away. The same thing is true for each one of us. No one can change the fact of the resurrection. And no one, no matter what, can take away the assurance of your salvation. And don't ever forget that. Another question is when? Where does time fit in to this message? Well, Peter reminded these earliest Christians that the time frame of their hope was in two stages. In the present, they were experiencing a living hope. That is, something in their lives which was giving them guidance and strength in the present. And the second stage was in the future. Salvation to be revealed in the last time. Now, these Christians were experiencing various trials and various sufferings. And Peter wanted to say to them that their present trials did not disprove their hope. Rather, it provided an opportunity for them to demonstrate the truthfulness of their hope. When I was in high school, I had some of my good friends who were not looking to go to college or university or to do anything like that. After graduation, they were hoping to get a good job and begin supporting themselves. And they were hoping in particular not only to get a well-paying job, but one that would be secure into the future. And I remember one friend in particular, he got a job with Coca-Cola Company, and he was kind of a truck driver slash rep, and he would drive around to stores, grocery stores, convenience stores, and he would deliver the product, and he would make sure that it was looking nice on the shelves. And it was a job that he enjoyed, and it was a job that he was paid fairly well to do. And given the popularity of the product, he thought it was a job that would last on into the future if he continued to work hard at it and to do it well. And whenever someone in our group would get a job like that, the others would say, well, he's set for life. That's what they'd say. He's set for life. Perhaps a bit naive, but that's how we thought of it at the time, that person was set for life. Well, we Christians are set for life. We're set for life in that we have a living hope which provides strength and guidance for all of our days, and it cannot be taken away. And even more than that, we are set for eternity. Perhaps the last question is, why? Why is all of this the case? And Peter provides the simplest answer of all. He said, because of God's great mercy. In other words, God made us, God loves each one of us, and God has mercy on us. God knows what we go through as human beings. God knows how difficult life can be, and how sometimes we suffer. And so God comes to us in mercy. A few weeks ago, I was called to conduct the funeral for a gentleman here in town who had passed away. And as one does when one is asked to go and conduct a funeral, you make contact with the family, and you go and meet them, and you try to learn as much as you can about them as a family and about the person who has passed away. And in the course of getting to know this family, I learned that when the gentleman who had died and his wife, many years ago, when they had been younger and they'd started their family, they had 3 children of their own. And alongside of raising their 3 children, they fostered many, many other children, perhaps as many as 12 or 15 over the years. And most of the children that they had fostered were able in some reasonable length of time to find a permanent home somewhere else, perhaps with a family member, a grandparent or an aunt or uncle, or whatever the case may be. But there were 2 of their foster children who were not able to find a permanent home and had no prospect of finding a permanent home somewhere else. And so this couple decided to adopt these two boys. And at the funeral, all 5 of the children, the couple's 3 biological children and their 2 adopted sons, got up together and they stood side by side, and they all talked about how much their dad had loved them and how much they had loved their dad. They were a family. There was no distinction between the children. Even one of the sons, now grown up, was of a different racial background. But that didn't matter. They were all the same family. And it was all because those parents had taken mercy on these children and brought them into their own family. And this is what God does with us. God knows what we go through. God knows what we fear and what we face. And God knows we don't always have the personal resources to deal with our challenges. But God doesn't leave us alone. God doesn't leave us hanging. God adopts us. You know, we're brought into the family of God no matter who we are, without distinction. We're loved as God's very own children. Life is full of mysteries, isn't it? I think that the mystery of D.B. Cooper will probably never be solved. You know, the American FBI still has it as an open case. They think it's likely that Cooper did not survive the jump, but they don't know for sure. And there are many mysteries in life, questions that we probably are never going to be able to answer. Our Christian faith contains mystery. There's an element of mystery in our faith. That's why we call it faith. We have to put our trust in things that we can't necessarily know for 100% certain. But the content of the Christian faith is not in itself a mystery. So we know that God has come to us in Jesus, that Jesus lived a perfectly faithful life and was even willing to die for that faith, and that God raised him from the dead, and that therefore we have a living hope and a promise that God is not only in our lives today, but that God is stronger even than death, and that God wants to hold us in love forever. And we know this not only because of Jesus in person, but because of the testimony of his earliest followers. A testimony which is in large part preserved in the documents of the New Testament, such as the first letter of Peter and the Gospels and many others. And what a great discovery this is. Good news, both now and forever. What a wonderful discovery. I think it's the grace of God is the greatest mystery of all time, and the discovery of God's grace in the good news of Jesus is also the greatest discovery of all time. Our next hymn together is number 660.